Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Logan Holt. Until the outbreak, I was the guy who fixed cameras and buzzers at the county prison. They called me whenever a gate stuck or a screen went black. Most days I worried more about work orders and overtime than about fences, floodlights, or the old Watchtower at the edge of the North Yard. The trouble didn't start with screaming or fire. It began subtly. First, a memo mentioned a violent flu in another state. Then a short email arrived about gloves and masks. Soon after, radio calls from medical staff grew frantic, their voices shaking. By the time local news showed footage of people attacking each other in the city, the problem was already here. Inmates were coughing in their cells. 2 officers had already been sent home with fevers, which they'd tried to blame on the bad air and long shifts. Inside the walls, our answer to any crisis was always the same: lock more doors. We'd simply wait for someone higher up to decide what came next. So when Central Control ordered a full lockdown and then went completely quiet, most of us just kept working, convinced help was on its way. That help never showed. The phones in admin rang with no one picking up, and the radios slid from steady chatter to single words and then to static. When the first infected reached the inner fence and kept moving even after the warning shots, it finally sank in. No one was coming. And every heavy door we'd sealed to keep inmates in now only made it harder for us to get out. Only one place offered what I needed: height, a clear view of every approach, and a single narrow path upward. That was the old Watchtower by the north fence. Once I understood that, the rest of my plan started there. By the time the second perimeter alarm froze on the screen and refused to clear, the control room felt off. Voices dropped, hands left keyboards. Eyes shifted from cameras to doors and radios. In that moment, the North Watchtower became more than just an old leftover on the map in my mind. Our prison sat a few miles outside town on flat ground. There was one main road in, a narrow service lane circling the fence, and housing units with admin in neat blocks. At the far corner, where the north line met a dry drainage ditch, stood the old Watchtower. It was a concrete tube with an inward opening steel door at the base, a tight stairwell inside, and a small glass room on top with its own power feed from the generator room. The outbreak didn't hit us as one big shock. It came in layers. First, a news story about aggression and fever in the city. Then a staff email about masks near intake. Later, calls from medical sounded more like fear than protocol. But when 2 officers from C Block stumbled into control, torn sleeves and dull eyes, describing an inmate who'd kept moving after a baton strike that should have dropped him cold, nobody pretended it was just flu anymore. Inside the fence, more inmates were coughing or sitting on bunks with their heads in their hands. A few already lay too still. Outside, the outer cameras began picking up people drifting toward the perimeter in 1s and 2s. Some wore uniforms, some street clothes. None walked like visitors. All of them seemed drawn to the fence as if they had nothing else left to aim for. Watching that slow build made something in my stomach go cold. I'd worked long enough inside those walls to know what happened when the power failed for real. Doors that relied on magnets or motors simply froze. Cameras died, yard lights went dark, and anything still moving, infected or not, went looking for sound and light. So I started asking myself a smaller, more immediate question. If those inner barriers failed, where was the one place I could still control who reached me? Every honest line I drew in my head led back to the same point: the tower at the north ditch. It had a single door I could brace with steel instead of just locking. Its stairwell was narrow enough for only one person to climb at a time, and its glass room was high enough to see over the fence. Once I framed it that way, staying in the main block felt less like safety and more like waiting in the lowest part of the building with no way to move sideways. Leaving meant giving up thicker walls, a full kitchen down the hall, and the comfort of being surrounded by other people. But staying meant trusting fuel levels I'd only seen on a clipboard, and relying on radio calls that were already dying mid-word. So I made myself a rule: I would take only what I could carry up those stairs at a steady pace. Tools first, then water, then food. If at any point on the way my gut told me to stop, I'd turn back and deal with whatever followed. In maintenance, I packed a duffel with gear I knew I could use without a manual. A drill, a hammer, a short pry bar, some fasteners, tape, a work light, gloves, and other small things that could turn a bare room into something I could actually secure. Then I added bottled water, basic first aid supplies, and enough dry food to cover the first few days without having to go back down immediately. I didn't stop to explain my plan to the room. Instead, I told the sergeant I was checking the north line on foot because the cameras up there had been glitchy, which was true enough. He barely looked up, buried under overlapping calls from housing and intake. So I walked out, the duffel biting into one shoulder, a shotgun from the open armory rack in my hands, feeling every step more acutely than I had in 10 years of routine checks. The path to the tower ran along the inner fence past 2 housing units and the utilities block. Then through a metal door, I entered the narrow access lane. As I moved, the noise of the main building faded behind me. It was replaced by the steady sound of my boots on concrete and a low, broken mix of voices from beyond the outer fence, which I didn't try to sort into words. When I reached the north yard, the main complex sat behind me, its powered doors living on borrowed time. Ahead of me, at the corner where the fence met the dry ditch, stood the old Watchtower on its cracked pad. Its narrow windows were dark, the glass room framed in faded metal. The ground-level steel door was closed but not chained, paint flaking from its hinges. I crossed the pavement toward it, my shoulder burning, my hands tight on the shotgun. I half expected to hear my name on the radio or to have someone yell for me to come back. But the channel on my belt stayed quiet. The only sound in my ear was my own breath. When my fingers closed around the cold handle of that door, I knew whatever came next would start there up that stairwell. It was a space small enough for one person to manage and high enough to see trouble coming before it reached the fence. The tower's base door was heavy steel set in a concrete frame. When I pulled the handle, it opened with a slow scrape, not a clean latch. That told me nobody had serviced this entrance in years. If I wanted it to keep anything out, I had to assume it was weaker than it looked. Inside, a short hallway led straight into the round stairwell. It was bare concrete on all sides with a dead light overhead. An alarm contact had a taped bypass wire, the kind of quick fix a tired tech makes when a sensor fails on a quiet shift. I stepped through and shut the door. After setting the shotgun against the wall, I threw the deadbolt. Then I leaned my shoulder into the slab and pushed until my legs shook. I felt the metal shift a little against the frame, heard the hinges creak. It was clear. The lock alone was more a suggestion than a true barrier. It might hold against one person who still respected doors, but not against a group that only understood weight. The hinges were surface-mounted and rusted around the screws. If enough force hit them, they would move first. I filed that away, understanding that a door usually shows you where it will fail if you pay attention. The stairwell wrapped the shaft in a tight spiral. Concrete steps hugged the wall, a metal rail bolted into the curve. There were no windows, no side doors, just a narrow climb that forced anyone on it into single file. This was the first real advantage this tower had over the wide corridors of the main blocks. The air smelled of dust and old paint. As I picked up the shotgun and the duffel and started to climb, each step sent a small echo ahead of me. Even before I saw the top, I was already learning how my own movement sounded inside the tube. By the time I reached the hatch leading into the watchroom, my thighs burned and my breath was loud. That mattered. Any plan I built up here had to work even when I was tired and rushed, not just when I had time to think. The hatch was a steel panel in the ceiling with a short ladder of rungs welded into the wall beneath it. It opened upward into the room. This design meant nothing on the roof could stand on it and pin me inside if I had to push through from below. I slung the shotgun across my chest. Then I climbed the rungs, the duffel bumping my hip. I pressed my shoulder into the hatch, holding my breath and listening for anything above me besides the faint hum from the cable that fed the room. When nothing scraped or shifted, I eased it open a few inches at a time until I could lift my head through and see before committing my full weight. The watch room was a glass box on 3 sides with a solid wall at my back. A low console where monitors had once sat and a single chair turned toward the yard were covered in a thin coat of dust. This was exactly what I wanted. It meant nobody had been slipping up here on breaks. I pulled myself into the room, set the duffel against the solid wall, and closed the hatch until it latched. Then I stood still for a slow count, letting the quiet settle. I needed to hear the difference between my own pulse and the noises outside. A scattered mix of shouting from the main complex and dull impacts traveling through the glass. From this height, the prison finally looked like a layout I could work with, not a maze. Housing units were on one side, admin and intake on the other. The main gate and road stretched straight ahead. Beyond the north fence lay the dry drainage ditch and thin tree line, elements that had always felt like mere background when I was on the ground. When I moved to the window facing the outer fence, I saw them. A handful of people were already pressed into the mesh, fingers threaded through the wire, bodies leaning forward as far as the metal would allow. Their heads sat at angles that didn't belong to any normal argument or plea. Farther out, near the ditch, more figures wandered in broken lines. They'd hit a barrier or another body, then simply stall. Watching that from above told me more than any radio call could. It showed the flow from town toward our fence was steady and one way. What we called a secure perimeter was merely the next solid surface that pressure would lean on until it found a weakness. So I stopped staring through the glass. I looked back at the hatch and the stairwell below and started thinking, how could I turn this tower from just a good view into an actual defensible home? The console under the windows held a crooked breaker box and a power strip dangling by its cord. It was clear the last person up here cared more about powering screens than doing things right. Trusting that mess in a crisis felt stupid, so I started stripping it down to something simple, something I could actually control. I unplugged the dead monitor cables, each small breaker I flipped off and on. I moved my work light from outlet to outlet until one brought the bulb up steady without flicker. That socket I marked in my head as the only one that mattered. Later, it would be the easiest point to feed from a battery once the main generator died. With that settled, I set the work light low on the console. I angled it to wash the hatch and the floor, keeping any glow from spilling across the windows where shadows could be seen from the yard. Next, I opened the duffel and laid out my starting kit in one row. It included a drill, driver bits, hammer, short pry bar, a box of screws and anchors, rolls of tape, a small first aid pouch, 2 bottles of water, 4 energy bars, and a folded sheet of heavy plastic I'd grabbed on reflex. It looked like a decent setup for fixing a door or patching a broken pane, but standing in the middle of that glass room with sirens dying in the distance, it also looked thin for staying alive more than a day or two. And that was the part that mattered now. Every safety briefing I'd ever taken used the same simple list: shelter, water, food, and communication. Those sessions had bored me at the time, but the order made sense in this tower. Shelter was the only item I could check off without hesitation, and even that came with a warning. I had height, a roof that didn't leak, 1 hatch, a narrow stairwell, and a steel-based door I could lock from inside. But if that lower door folded, the stairwell would become a funnel pointed straight at me. And the glass walls up here weren't going to stop anything for long. Water and food amounted to whatever was on the floor in front of me. Barely enough to get through the first stretch. The only power came from a generator someone else had to keep alive. That meant every hour I waited made my first trips harder. It would have been easy to sink into the chair. I could have watched the monitors for as long as they stayed on, telling myself that help was on the way. The same way we always did when something ugly started outside the fence. But looking down at the outer perimeter killed that thought fast. More figures kept drifting toward the mesh from the fields and the access road. Some wore street clothes, some uniforms from town. None walked like people who were going to turn around and leave. Waiting up here with just 2 bottles of water and a pocket radio would turn into a slow death. So the choice was clear. move while the inner yard still looked like a workplace, or sit still until every path between the main buildings and this tower turned into a gauntlet. Before leaving, I locked the hatch from above. I pushed the rolling chair away, slid the empty console closer to the solid wall, and cleared a straight path from the ladder to each window. When you come up those rungs in a hurry, heart racing, the last thing you need is a cable under your boot. Then I slung the shotgun tight against my chest. I grabbed the duffel by its straps and went back down the spiral stairs. I counted the turns and the steps out of habit, not because the numbers mattered yet, but because I knew they would if I ever had to climb in the dark. The base door still opened to heat, bright light, and the usual mix of smells. Dust, cut grass, diesel from the gatehouse. But the sound above it was wrong. More engines than usual, more shouting, fewer jokes. When I stepped into the lane along the inner fence, I saw officers clustered near the main entrance, trying to turn away cars. Their hands waved in hard motions that clearly said, "No more room." Inmates who could see the yard crowded their small windows, looking out instead of at their televisions. The whole place felt less like a controlled facility and more like a box someone kept shaking. I kept my head down. I walked like a man on a job he didn't want, cutting into the maintenance cage without anyone stopping me to ask where I was going. Inside the cage, I ignored everything that wouldn't matter in 2 hours. I went straight for the shelves that could feed a tower. I pulled down a box of concrete anchors, extra screws, a short length of chain, 2 knee-high steel bars we used as temporary braces, another folded sheet of plastic, and every unopened bottle of water in reach. Then I packed them tight into the duffel, arranging them around the hard edges so the load would ride close to my back. I re-entered the tower, duffel on one shoulder, shotgun across my chest. The stairwell felt hotter and tighter. I shut the base door, threw the bolt, and pushed. I needed to know exactly how much it would give. The slab still shifted a little under my shoulder, but it didn't flex as much as it had the first time. When I dropped the steel bar into its brackets, the door stopped feeling decorative and started feeling solid. Good enough for now, because the next hands on it wouldn't care about warnings or keys. Up in the watchroom, I set the duffel down by the solid wall. I lined the tools and bottles in a neat row. Then I drank a small pull of water, not for thirst, but to steady myself before I went back to the glass. From this height, the outer fence looked worse than an hour earlier. More people were pressed into the mesh, fingers locked around the wire. Their shoulders leaned in as if they'd forgotten how to stand on their own and needed the metal to hold them up. Some wore uniforms from town, some street clothes. A few had smears of blood down their arms. Every few minutes, another body drifted in from the fields or off the access road, settled against the fence and stayed there without moving. The inner yard stayed mostly clear, but the officers moving between housing and the gate walked with their heads up, radios tight to their mouths, as if every step might push things over the edge. Even from up here, I could tell no one was treating this like a short shift problem anymore. On the road outside the front lot, cars stacked up behind the barricade, horns blared. A sedan rammed the rear bumper of a truck until metal bent. When an officer finally fired a warning shot into the air, some of the bodies at the fence flinched. Then they turned their faces toward the Watchtower instead of the gate. I didn't know if they could really see me, but I knew how sound moved across that yard on quiet nights. So I turned the work light away from the windows, killed it, and waited. I needed the shapes below to turn into a dim pattern I could track without putting my outline against the glass. Inside the complex, the power dipped twice in quick pulses, corridor lights dimmed, then came back weaker. That familiar stutter told me the generator system was fighting uneven loads. It wouldn't win for long, no matter what the maintenance logs claimed. Down by the gate, officers tried one last time to manage the crowd. They backed away from hands that reached through the bars, shouting with open palms in front of them. But even from up here, I could see panic beating procedure with every shove and every raised voice. Radios on their shoulders crackled with broken words. Someone pointed toward the parking lot. Someone else shook his head. Then the 2 men at the front simply gave up on holding the gate. They stepped back toward the main doors, leaving the people outside to decide their own direction with no one giving orders. Watching that from the tower forced a decision I'd been avoiding. If this room was only a place to hide, then I'd already waited too long to build it out. But if it was going to be home, then every minute while the yard was still mostly clear had to count. There was nowhere else closer than town that offered height, one entrance, and a clear view of the approaches. The streets between here and there were already feeding the fence. So telling myself I'd find something better if I ran later was just lying to myself for comfort. Treating the tower as a hiding spot meant dying when the first real crowd reached the base and I had nothing ready. Treating it as a base meant putting in work now that would buy me seconds and minutes when it mattered. The first problem I could actually control was sound. The infected were already reacting to noise at the fence, and this tower turned every drop tool into a loud ring, so I cut the folded plastic into strips. I wrapped the feet of the rolling chair and the handles of the metal tools I planned to keep near the hatch. I laid another piece under the console, knowing I'd set things down harder there when I was tired. This turned sharp edges on steel into dull contact on plastic. It felt like a small fix, but it removed one simple way to betray my position after dark. The second thing I could do without going back down was build a simple alarm. It didn't depend on power or software, but would tell me if anything reached the tower's base before fists started hitting the steel. I tied a few bolts and an extra keyring into a short chain. I clipped it to a length of paracord and lowered it through the narrow vent window. It hung just above the concrete pad outside the base door, free to swing if anything brushed past the wall. In a structure this quiet, the rattle of metal on metal would travel straight up the shaft. I'd hear it whether I was standing at the window or half asleep on the floor. That was all I needed from it. I had just tied the cord off when the first real group from town reached the inner gate. They weren't staff or inmates, just civilians whose cars had made it past the roadblock. From above, they looked less like an orderly line and more like a crowd that didn't know which way to pull. From the tower, the crowd at the inner gate still looked expectant. They seemed to believe someone would walk out and fix things. Hands were up, faces turned toward the steps, not toward the bodies tangled in the outer fence. The line bent and folded as more cars stacked on the road, horns blaring. Every loud sound made more of the infected at the fence turn their heads toward the prison. I watched long enough to accept one clear truth. Nothing in the main complex was going back to normal. If I tied my chances to any of it, I'd go down with it when it finally broke. The only part of this place that worked in my favor was the tower. Even then it was true only if I turned it from a simple lookout into something meant to withstand more than just the weather. The base door came first because if that failed, nothing above it mattered. I went back down the stairs carrying a box of anchors and longer screws. I opened the door just enough to see the frame in daylight. The slab looked solid, but when I leaned into it from the outside, it rattled instead of taking the hit. That told me the hinges were doing all the work without enough bite into the wall. I pulled the old short screws and drove in longer ones that cut deeper into the concrete. Then I added 2 more through the hinge plates, spreading the door's weight across more points. After that, I mounted a steel bar across the inside. It was fixed in brackets on both sides of the frame at chest height. When I dropped it into place, anyone pushing from outside would hit the bar before they stressed the latch. I shut the door, threw the deadbolt, and dropped the bar. The sound changed from a loose clank to a dull, solid thud. Leaning my shoulder into the metal, I finally met real resistance instead of just a shake. The next problem was the gap at the bottom where daylight leaked through in a thin line. It was nothing when the world was normal. Now it was a slot for fingers or tools that could wedge the door or make noise every time it moved. I cut a strip from a rubber mat. I pressed it tight across the threshold on the inside and fixed it in place with short screws and washers. When I tested the door again, the light at the base was gone. Anything that tried to drag under it would now meet a band of rubber and steel instead of open air. With the door stronger, I turned back to the stairs because everything that reached the tower had to come up that spiral. Halfway up, I chose a landing where the wall curved tight. I drilled anchors for 2 removable bars, one at knee height and one at shoulder height. They were set into brackets so I could swing them down as I climbed and lift them again when I needed to move gear. In a rush, those bars would make anyone behind me slow down, step over, duck under, and break their rhythm. Near the top, I drove 3 short strips of coarse tape onto separate steps. They were spaced so that when I climbed in the dark, my boots would hit them in a clear pattern. This would tell me where I was without counting turns. If something heavy started up after me, the sound of soles grinding over those rough patches would carry up the shaft. Back in the watch room, the glass walls became the next job. They were thick enough to take a casual hit, but not enough to trust against the kind of strain building outside. So I moved the console and chair away from the center and used them as braces. I slid the console under the side windows to act as a low barrier. Then I tipped the steel chair on its side and wedged it tight against the front window. Its legs braced between the console and the solid wall. This way, anything strong enough to crack the glass would still have to fight through metal before it reached the middle of the room. I rolled out a sheet of heavy plastic under the window line and taped it down. If a pane broke, most of the shards would drop onto a surface I could fold and clear instead of cutting into every corner. Once the structure felt less fragile, I dealt with sound and simple warning. I left the small chain and bolt rattle hanging on its cord near the base of the tower, ready to tap the concrete and steel if anything bumped the door. I also added another line that ran from a hook by the hatch to a bolt near the ceiling. If I was half asleep on the floor and that cord twitched, the motion would be enough to wake me before fists started beating on the stairwell. By the time I stepped back and looked around, the room still looked like the same narrow box of glass and metal, but it felt different under my hands and feet. The door at the bottom no longer shifted like loose hardware. The stairs now had places that would slow anything that followed me. And the windows had more between them and my back than thin air. It wasn't a fortress, but it was finally something built with purpose instead of habit. And that was enough for the next step, turning from concrete and steel to the things that would run out first on water, food, and power. The next morning I woke to the sound of rain on the roof. It immediately told me 2 things. The pipes still had pressure, and I had a chance to tackle one of my biggest problems before that changed. Water was the absolute first priority on every survival list. Up here, I only had a few bottles and what I'd already consumed. Staying alive meant using whatever was left in the system before it vanished. Down in the main blocks, every cell had a sink and a toilet. Staff areas boasted bigger lines for showers in the kitchen, but the tower stood off on its own, fed by a narrow pipe that ran up through the concrete shaft, old and easy to ignore when nothing was wrong. I checked the small utility panel by the hatch. There I found a shut-off valve with worn paint. I turned it slowly, hearing a faint rush wake up in the wall. Then I opened the tiny sink in the corner of the watch room and watched a weak but steady stream run clear. I filled every bottle and empty jug I had. Then grabbing the duffel, I went back down the stairs, one hand on the rail, the other on the shotgun. The alarms outside had gone quiet overnight, and that silence felt heavier than any noise. At the base door, I listened. All I heard was rain on the pad and a distant, unceasing car alarm. Then I eased the door open a hand's width and checked the yard. The crowd at the main entrance had thinned, some people gone, some on the ground, a few still moving between cars. However, the bodies at the outer fence had doubled. The way they hung there made it clear no one was coming through to help from that side. No one looked toward the north tower, so I stepped out into the rain. I kept low along the inner fence, cutting back through the utilities door into the service hall. Inside, the overhead lights flickered with a tired pulse. That meant the generator was either straining or already running low, so I moved faster. In the staff bathroom, I opened every tap, filling plastic bins, bottles, and one mop bucket. Then I shut off the valves under the sinks, hoping to trap whatever was left in the lines for later. In the break room, I raided the fridge and cupboards. I grabbed anything that wouldn't rot in a day: instant noodles, canned soup, packets of oatmeal. Anything with a distant date stamped into the metal. I hauled the first load back to the tower in 2 trips, water sloshing against the sides of the bin, my shotgun bouncing against my back. By the time everything sat in a row along the solid wall of the watchroom, the floor felt smaller, but my chances felt a little bigger. It wasn't a long-term store, yet it was far more than I'd had when I first locked the hatch. Power came next, because light and a working radio were my only links to anything beyond the fence. In the maintenance shop, we kept 2 deep batteries for backup lighting. Each one was heavy enough to make my arms shake by the 3rd step, but together they meant I could run a small light and a radio for days. If I was careful, I checked their charge with the simple indicator on the case. Both showed green. I rolled them back to the tower on a dolly that bumped over every crack in the concrete. Getting the batteries up the spiral was slow work. I moved them one at a time, hugging each case to my chest, boots planted before every step. I rested at the landing where I'd mounted the crossbars. By the time I set the second one down against the wall in the watchroom, sweat ran down my back and my hands shook, but the sight of those 2 black boxes under the console made the room feel less like a dead end. As the day stretched, I started organizing the room the way I'd marked equipment racks back when life was normal. Water jugs went along one wall, food in a neat stack near the hatch, tools in a fixed corner, medical supplies in a small crate by the chair. Nothing was left loose where it could roll underfoot in a rush. I thought about pushing farther down toward the main kitchen or even the inmate blocks, but every step in that direction meant more blind corners and more doors I couldn't see past. None of that food would matter if I didn't make it back here. For now, the rule was simple: stay inside lines I could watch and hold. I forced myself to eat something simple and drink on a schedule instead of waiting until my hands shook. Letting hunger or thirst sneak up would get me killed faster than anything at the fence. While I chewed, I watched the inner yard. I counted the remaining staff moving between doors and tracked how long the light stayed steady before the next flicker. Each dip lasted longer than the last. On the 4th one, the emergency channel on the radio cut out mid-sentence and never came back. After the radio died, the tower settled into a thin daily routine. Each morning I checked the base door. I pressed my shoulder into the steel, felt the hinges and the bar, and told myself it still held. I walked the spiral stairs with my light off until my feet knew every step. Outside, fewer uniforms moved between the blocks. More infected drifted against the outer fence. I watched long enough to see their patterns, brief rushes, then stillness. A single shout or slammed door could pull a handful of them off the fence, so I treated sound like fuel, spending as little of it as possible. One afternoon, I heard something that didn't fit the usual pattern: slow steps on gravel and a low voice counting beneath the wind. At the side window, I saw 3 figures in the ditch beyond the outer fence. They walked single file, heads down, keeping below the road. The first carried a backpack and a short shotgun. The second had a duffel and a length of pipe. The third was smaller, maybe a teenager, wearing an orange hoodie that made him too easy to spot. They followed the ditch until it ran close to the north fence. They checked the road both ways, then crossed at a crouch, staying low until they reached the tower's shadow. The infected at the outer line were turned toward the main gate, pulled by some distant noise I'd missed, so no one watched the 3 climb the inner slope. When they stepped onto the concrete pad and looked up, my shotgun was already resting on the console, my finger along the stock. The woman in front raised her hands higher than the others. "We see you," she called on. "We're not sick. We just need height and a door that closes." I kept my answer simple. "Hands where I can see them. Stay clear of the door." They backed up until their heels were to the edge of the pad. "Roll your sleeves up," I said. "Slow." They did what I asked. No bites, no fresh bandages, just old scrapes and dust. I told the man with the shotgun to set it on the ground and step away, then asked, "Names?" "Maria," the woman said. She nodded toward him. "Dean, the kid is Eli. We came from town and followed the ditch. Your tower is the only thing that still looks built to last." Eli spoke before she could say more. We had a house for a while, he said. They pushed in through the garage. We ran when the glass started to crack. 3 more people meant more mouths to feed and more noise, but it also meant more hands to haul water and gear and more eyes on the stairs while I slept. Turning them away without a clear reason felt too much like pushing them toward the fence. I can't promise much, I said. You can stay if you follow my rules. No shouting, no lights by the windows. Nobody opens the base door unless I say so. You help me keep this tower safe or you go back down. Maria nodded once. Fair enough. I dropped the rope I'd tied off by the hatch and clipped an empty crate to it. Then I pulled it back up to show them the system. Bags first, I said. Guns empty and separate. You climb one at a time, one hand on the rail, the other where I can see it. It took a while, but they followed. Each pack rode up in the crate. Then each of them climbed alone. Boots ringing on the concrete and breath loud in the shaft, I checked their wrists and necks again when they stepped through the hatch. Up close, they looked like anyone who'd walked too far and slept too little. Dark eyes, tight shoulders, I kept the shotgun where they could see it. Then I shut and locked the hatch behind Eli when he came through last. This room is all we have, I said. 1 door at the bottom, these stairs, this hatch, and 3 walls of glass. We keep it tidy and quiet. We boil every drop of water. If you feel sick, you say it early. We split the night into watches. Dean sat with his back to the solid wall and let out a slow breath. You got a name, or do we just call you Tower Guy? Logan, I said. You're here as long as you help keep the tower standing. That's the trade. Maria set 2 cans and a pot near my stack of food. Eli sat near the side window but stayed back from the glass, watching the yard the way I had been. For the first time since I climbed into this room, I wasn't the only one listening for footsteps on the stairs. The tower felt a little less like a hiding place and a little more like a place we might actually hold. After the radio died, the tower settled into a thin daily routine. Each morning I checked the base door. I pressed my shoulder into the steel, felt the hinges in the bar, and told myself it still held. I walked the spiral stairs with my light off until my feet knew every step. Outside, fewer uniforms moved between the blocks. More infected drifted against the outer fence. I watched long enough to see their patterns. Brief rushes, then stillness. A single shout or slammed door could pull a handful of them off the fence. So I treated sound like fuel, spending as little of it as possible. One afternoon, I heard something that didn't fit the usual pattern. Slow steps on gravel, and a low voice counting beneath the wind. At the side window, I saw 3 figures in the ditch beyond the outer fence. They walked single file, heads down, keeping below the road. The first carried a backpack and a short shotgun. The second had a duffel and a length of pipe. The third was smaller, maybe a teenager, wearing an orange hoodie that made him too easy to spot. They followed the ditch until it ran close to the north fence. They checked the road both ways, then crossed at a crouch, staying low until they reached the tower's shadow. The infected at the outer line were turned toward the main gate, pulled by some distant noise I'd missed. So, no one watched the 3 climb the inner slope. When they stepped onto the concrete pad and looked up, my shotgun was already resting on the console, my finger along the stock. The woman in front raised her hands higher than the others. "We see you," she called. "We're not sick. We just need height and a door that closes." I kept my answer simple. Hands where I can see them. Stay clear of the door. They backed up until their heels were to the edge of the pad. "Roll your sleeves up," I said. "Slow." They did what I asked. No bites, no fresh bandages, just old scrapes and dust. I told the man with the shotgun to set it on the ground and step away, then asked, "Names?" "Maria," the woman said. She nodded toward him. "Dean. The kid is Eli. We came from town and followed the ditch. Your tower is the only thing that still looks built to last." Eli spoke before she could say more. "We had a house for a while," he said. "They pushed in through the garage. We ran when the glass started to crack. 3 more people meant more mouths to feed and more noise, but it also meant more hands to haul water and gear and more eyes on the stairs while I slept. Turning them away without a clear reason felt too much like pushing them toward the fence. "I can't promise much," I said. "You can stay if you follow my rules. No shouting, no lights by the windows, nobody opens the base door unless I say so. You help me keep this tower safe or you go back down." Maria nodded once. "Fair enough." I dropped the rope I'd tied off by the hatch and clipped an empty crate to it. Then I pulled it back up to show them the system. "Bags first," I said. "Guns empty and separate. You climb one at a time, one hand on the rail, the other where I can see it." It took a while, but they followed. Each pack rode up in the crate. Then each of them climbed alone, boots ringing on the concrete and breath loud in the shaft. I checked their wrists and necks again when they stepped through the hatch. Up close, they looked like anyone who'd walked too far and slept too little. Dark eyes, tight shoulders. I kept the shotgun where they could see it. Then I shut and locked the hatch behind Eli when he came through last. "This room is all we have," I said. "One door at the bottom, these stairs, this hatch, and 3 walls of glass. We keep it tidy and quiet. We boil every drop of water. If you feel sick, you say it early. We split the night into watches, and Dean sat with his back to the solid wall and let out a slow breath. "You got a name, or do we just call you Tower Guy?" "Logan," I said. "You're here as long as you help keep the tower standing. That's the trade." Maria set 2 cans and a pot near my stack of food. Eli sat near the side window but stayed back from the glass, watching the yard the way I had been. For the first time since I climbed into this room, I wasn't the only one listening for footsteps on the stairs. The tower felt a little less like a hiding place and a little more like a place we might actually hold. The storm rolled in from the west, a straight line of low clouds stacked over the fields. A wind pushed dust across the yard. By late afternoon, the sky looked wrong enough that even Eli stopped talking, just watching it darken. Storms had always been loud out here, but they used to sit in the background behind a grid of lights and working radios. Now, half the blocks were dead. The fence carried a wall of bodies leaning toward every sound. The same thunder that once hid bad hinges could now drag trouble straight to our door. We moved before the first hard drops hit. Dean checked the base door from inside and out, his shoulder against the steel, eyes on the hinges and the bar, feeling for any new shift. Maria walked the spiral with a flashlight, tapping each crossbar and counting the steps out loud to keep the numbers in her head. I cleared the watchroom. I taped down a loose cable, pulled the console tighter to the solid wall, and switched everything over to battery power. 1 covered lamp at the hatch and 1 line to the radio. When the rain came in full, it hit hard. It was a flat sheet that swallowed the yard, turning shouting at the main gate into a smear of sound under the drum of the roof. Lightning flashed behind the clouds. For a heartbeat, the bodies at the fence showed as pale, tightly packed shapes, then slipped back into shadow. Thunder rolled over the concrete, and each deep hit shook dust from the ceiling of the shaft. The main power went a few minutes later. Yard lights blinked, dimmed, and died. The blocks dropped from yellow squares to scattered windows. Up in the tower, the overhead light flicked once, then stayed off. Only our small lamp by the hatch held steady off the battery. The radio gave a soft pop, then a long hiss. We weren't blind, but the world outside the glass vanished into black. The first hit on the base door came under the rain, a dull thud that carried up the shaft with the chain rattle by the vent. Then came a second and a third, spaced a few seconds apart. Dean moved to the middle landing, 1 hand on the rail, the other on the lower bar. "They're here," he said, not trying the handle, just slamming into it. "We don't answer," I said, keeping my voice low so it stayed in the concrete. "No shots, no yelling, let the door do its job." The banging built in uneven waves. More weight was thrown at the same patch of steel every time the thunder rolled close, and the whole tower picked up a slow vibration. The bar groaned in its brackets on 1 hard surge. The rubber at the threshold squealed once as the slab flexed and settled back, but the longer screws in the hinges held. The chain on the vent kept its small rattle, not the sharp clang that would have meant a real shift. We waited and listened. There was nothing smart left to try. The rain hammered. Thunder cracked close enough once that the windows flashed white and the console jumped. In that flash, we saw a dark patch on the ground near the fence, a gap in the line of bodies that the rest closed as soon as the light faded below that. The hits on the door rose and fell, never quite matching the sky. It was an ugly rhythm with no pattern we could brace for. We could only ride it out. "At least they don't think to hit in time together," Maria said quietly, sitting on the floor with her back to the wall, shotgun across her knees. "If they kick like a squad, that bar snaps." "They don't think at all," Dean answered from the stairs. "That's our edge. Don't give it back." At some point, Eli started counting under his breath, steady numbers that ran past 100 and kept going. It was something for his mind to hold on to while we listened, and kept our fingers off the triggers. Time stretched. The storm slid east. The thunder rolled farther away. The banging drifted from constant to scattered. A hit here, a scrape there, one heavy body sliding down the steel. Then a longer gap came. Rain still hit the roof, but the chain by the vent remained quiet. We waited 10 full minutes, no one speaking, and then another 5 for good measure. "If they're still there, they're not moving," Dean said. "Either way, the door did its part." We didn't open it to check in the dark. Curiosity was for daylight. When morning came, gray and flat, we eased the hatch open. Looking down through the side window, we saw 3 bodies on the pad in front of the door, twisted and still. The outer fence bowed under more weight than it had the day before, but that line held too. Our hinges sat where we'd set them. The bar stayed in its brackets. The rubber strip at the base showed fresh scars, but no daylight. The tower wasn't perfect, but it had taken a real hit and stayed standing. It proved the work mattered. We turned an old shell into something that could buy us hours when minutes might have been all we got. And that meant the next decisions weren't about just surviving the night anymore. They were about who else was still out there and whether this tower was going to stay our whole world or just our starting point. By the second week, the pattern outside stopped surprising us. More infected drifted in from the road and fields each day, ending up pressed into the outer fence or stalled in the lane behind dead cars. Inside the tower, our world shrank to 4 jobs in one room. Each morning, someone checked the base door. Someone walked the stairs and touched every bar. Someone watched the yard. And someone boiled water and counted cans. At night, we wrote a few lines in a notebook so the days wouldn't blur into one long shift. The break in that routine came on a clear late morning with an empty sky and a quiet yard. Maria was changing a bandage on Dean's hand. Eli was at the side window and I was at the console trying to guess how much more weight the fence could take. Suddenly, the emergency band on the radio snapped from a soft hiss to a clean woman's voice. "Holt Tower, this is North Command," she said. "If you read, respond with your status." For a second, none of us moved. Then I picked up the radio and kept it simple. 4 survivors, I said. Old prison watchtower on the north fence, reinforced door and stairs. Stable water. Heavy infected on the outer line. Light movement on the road. Copy 4, she answered. We have a small ground team passing your sector in 48 hours. They cannot enter the prison grounds. They can hold for 15 minutes at the old service station north of you, at the junction of County 4 and the access road. If you can reach that point on foot, they can move you to a larger secured site. If you cannot, we will log you as staying in place and mark your tower as occupied. Confirm intent. We all knew the station she meant. A low building with faded pumps and a metal canopy, the last stop before the highway opened up. Before the outbreak, I'd bought bad coffee there after night shifts. Now, the ditch, the outer lane, and whatever waited near stalled cars sat between us and that lot. We need a minute, I said into the mic. Stand by. I turned the volume down and sat with my back to the solid wall. The others came in close. We talked about leaving someday, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, but talk is easy when there's no date on it. Now we had a time and a junction. If we stay, I said, this tower probably holds for a while. The door is solid, the bars are good, the water is still running. But the fence is tearing more every day and the bodies inside the lane aren't moving. At some point, we run out of room or luck. If we go, Dean said, we bet everything on one walk. We step off this pad and either make it to that station or we don't. No backup, no second window, just whatever is in that truck and whatever waits in the ditch. Maria looked at the notes we'd taped to the wall. This place got us through the worst month of my life, she said. But it's not getting better. And no one is coming with more fuel and wire if there really is a bigger site, and they're organized enough to send a team on schedule. That's already more than we have. Eli kept his eyes on the yard. If we stay, this becomes everything I know, he said. One room, one fence, one kind of problem. I don't want that to be the whole story for me. We didn't vote. We talked until no one had anything new to add. In the end, it felt simple. The tower had bought us time and a real choice. Staying would turn it into our whole world. Leaving would hurt, but it was a decision we could still make, not one forced upon us. I turned the volume back up and pressed the button. North Command, this is Holt Tower, I said. We can reach the service station on foot if we travel light and move early. 4 survivors, 1 minor. We intend to make the attempt. Copy, Holt Tower, she said. Ground will hold at that junction in 48 hours, local midday for 15 minutes. Mark with bright cloth or panels and stay under cover until you identify our vehicle. If you miss the window, we will consider you still in place. Good luck, Tower. When the static came back, the room felt different. Not safer, not worse, just closer to done. We spent the next day getting the tower ready. Not for us, but for whoever might find it after we left. We left the long screws in the hinges and the bar across the base door. We checked the anchors on the stair crosspieces and swung them up, ready to drop. We left the small chain rattle by the vent, ensuring any weight on the pad would still send sound up the shaft. One battery stayed wired to a switch under the console, and I taped a strip of paper beside it that just said light with an arrow. Maria wrote clear notes on a sheet of plastic and fixed it by the hatch. She kept the sentences short. Base door is barred here. Water storage usually sits under the console. Do not shout near the windows. Do not waste rounds on the fence. Listen at noon on emergency if the radio still works. Eli folded one bright blanket and set it on the console as a ready marker for anyone who needed to flag a passing truck. On our last morning in the tower, we followed the same routine we had built from nothing. Dean checked the base door and the hinges. Maria walked the stairs and touched every bar. Eli counted the jugs and cans. I checked the batteries and the radio and took one slow look around the room. Then we packed only what we could carry at a steady pace. Water, a little food, the medical kit, one radio, one small light each, and the weapons we knew how to use without thinking. There was no room for souvenirs. The tower had given us height and time. That was enough. On our last morning, we checked the door, the stairs, the water, and the radio one more time, then packed only what we could carry. We opened the base door and stepped out, leaving the tower ready for whoever came next. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.